A man buys a burned-down bank to escape his past, only to discover someone else's hidden beneath the ashes. The deeper he digs, the louder the past begins to speak. A lost child, a guilty secret, and a truth that refuses to die. If you believe memory can haunt and heal, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. The sky above Ashford Pines wore that faint gray-blue of late October, the kind that dulled the edges of mountains and made even sunlight feel hesitant. Eli Carter pulled his pickup to a stop beside the crumbling stone steps of what used to be the First Ashford Savings Bank. The for sale sign was half buried in weeds, the phone number faded to ghosts of digits. He stepped out, boots sinking into wet earth, and stared at the building like a man looking into his own past, worn, empty, and a little ashamed to still be standing. He'd spent the last 12 years fighting fire for the Forest Service, until the fire fought back, consuming not just acres, but his will. The official report called it a containment failure. Eli called it the day I stopped belonging anywhere. So when the county clerk mentioned a condemned property going for less than $500, mostly scrap, but it's got walls. He'd nodded because walls were more than he had. Inside, dust floated like ash, settling on the long-dead counters and safety deposit boxes. He could still smell the faint metallic ghost of smoke from a fire decades old. Every step echoed too loudly, as though the place resented being disturbed. He found a few charred papers in the corners of ledgers and bank receipts from the 90s, before the fire that had gutted the town's economy and hearts. When he reached the old vault door rusted shut and half collapsed, he ran his hand over its surface, cold metal under his palm, a sign of life, even if not his. He whispered half to himself, "Guess we're both survivors, huh?" The realtor had told him the story, of course, how a faulty electrical line had sparked a blaze in 1998, how the bank went up overnight, how the town never really recovered. But standing there, Eli could tell there was more beneath the surface, something unspoken. The silence here wasn't empty, it was watchful. For the first few days, Eli slept in the truck outside. He'd wandered the nearby diner each morning for coffee and eggs, where Nora Mayfield, the gray-haired owner, watched him from behind the counter. She had the air of someone who'd been waiting too long for something she couldn't name. "You're the one who bought the old bank," she said one morning. Her voice had that gentle rasp of time and cigarettes. Eli nodded. "Figured it might keep me dry through winter." Nora studied him for a beat too long. "That place, some things ought to stay buried." He offered a faint smile. "I don't scare easy." She smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. That's what the last one said. That night he unrolled his sleeping bag in the bank's main room. The wind howled through the cracked windows, scattering bits of plaster like snow. He tried to ignore the creaks in the walls, the sound of a loose shutter knocking rhythmically like a heartbeat. Around midnight, while he warmed canned beans on a camping stove, something metallic clinked faintly beneath the floorboards. He froze. It came again, a dull, hollow thud, as if something shifting deep below. "Rats," he muttered, though it didn't sound convincing. The next morning, determined to make the place livable, he began clearing out debris. Near the back corner, beneath what used to be a teller's counter, his crowbar struck something solid. He knelt and brushed away the dirt, a small tin box warped by heat. The lid was brittle, breaking off in his hands. Inside lay a photograph, faded but intact, of a woman holding a little girl in front of this very bank. Both were smiling, unaware their lives would one day be reduced to ash. There was a note taped behind the picture. The ink blurred, but legible enough, "Return what was never ours." A.M. He turned the photograph over. The child had a ribbon in her hair, bright, even through the film's age and the woman's eyes. There was something about them, a quiet defiance that didn't match the gentle smile. That night, Eli brought the picture to the diner. "Recognize them?" he asked Nora. She looked once and dropped her coffee pot. It shattered, sending steam and shards across the counter. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "That's Anna Miller. And her mama, Margaret. They both died in the fire." Both, Eli asked softly. "You sure?" Nora's hands trembled as she wiped the spill. "They found Margaret's body near the vault. But they never found Anna's." Eli stared down at the photograph tracing the child's outline. Something tightened in his chest. Grief for people he'd never met, or maybe for himself. "You said some things should stay buried," he murmured. "What happens if they don't?" Nora didn't answer. She simply looked at him, with eyes that carried the weight of too many years and too many secrets. Later that evening, Eli sat alone in the bank again, the photograph propped beside his lantern. Outside rain began to fall soft at first, then harder, drumming against the old roof. He could almost imagine the building breathing with him, both trying to remember how to feel alive. When the clock on the wall, a relic still hanging crooked, ticked to midnight, he heard it again, that faint metallic sound beneath the floor. This time he didn't pretend it was rats. He stood lantern in hand and whispered into the dark. "Anna." The wind fell silent, and somewhere deep below something or someone answered with a single hollow echo like a heart that hadn't stopped beating. The storm lingered over Ashford Pines for 3 days, drenching the small town in a constant gray drizzle that blurred the streets and swallowed sound. Inside the abandoned bank, Eli Carter worked silently, sweeping soot and plaster from the floor, pretending the faint smell of smoke wasn't real. He kept glancing at the photograph of the woman and little girl on his workbench, the one he'd found in the tin box. Their faces seemed too alive for something buried this long. When the rain finally broke, Eli carried the photo across the street to Nora Mayfield's bakery. The scent of cinnamon and fresh bread clung to the air, a soft contrast to the damp chill outside. Nora saw the picture and froze mid-motion, her hands dusted with flour, trembling slightly. "That's Anna Miller," she whispered after a long silence. "And her mother, Margaret. They died in the fire." Eli frowned. Both Nora hesitated, her eyes glinting with something between fear and grief. "They never found Anna's body," she said. "Too much heat, they claimed. But I worked in that bank, Eli. I saw that girl almost every day. She was curious about everything bright like sunlight through glass. No one like that just disappears." Eli could see the memory pressing against her heavy as the years that had passed. Sometimes she added, voice low when the wind's right. "I swear I still hear her laughing." That night Eli sat beside the vault with a small lantern and his old field recorder, the one he'd used years ago to log wildfire reports. He pressed the red button, letting the tape roll as he spoke softly. "Ashford Savings Bank, Day 4. Structure mostly stable, temperature dropping. No signs of recent entry, but the building feels occupied." He laughed, dryly uneasy even to his own ears. Hours later, lying on his sleeping bag, he replayed the tape and froze. Beneath the hiss of static and dripping water, a sound surfaced, soft, high-pitched, unmistakable. A child's laugh echoing faintly as though bouncing off the vault walls. His hand went cold. He replayed it again. It was still there. The next evening, wind whipped through the cracked windows, making the old wooden beams creak and whisper. Eli told himself it was just weather, a lonely building settling, but sometime past midnight, he heard it again. A giggle, brief and airy, near the staircase leading to the basement. He stood up, flashlight in hand. "Hello," he called out, his voice small against the dark. No answer, only the sigh of the storm outside. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something just beyond sight was listening back. The next morning he bought new wiring and light bulbs from the hardware store, determined to bring power into the building again. The young clerk recognized him. "You're the guy fixing up the old bank," he said, scanning the supplies. "My uncle worked the fire investigation back then. Said there were records in that vault, things that didn't belong in a bank." Eli's pulse quickened. "What kind of things?" The clerk shrugged, didn't say. Just stopped sleeping right after. When Eli flipped the main switch later that afternoon, yellow light flooded the dusty lobby for the first time in 2 decades. Shadows jumped along the walls like living things. For a fleeting second, the bank looked almost whole again, but the light didn't make him feel safer. It made him feel seen. He placed the recorder beside the vault once more and sat in silence. At first, nothing. Then a faint metallic sound vibrated through the floor, followed by a single knock, then 2 more evenly spaced. Eli's breath caught. He whispered, "Anna." The knocking stopped, leaving only the sound of his heart. He followed the direction of the noise through a narrow corridor at the back. The air grew colder as he descended, each step heavier, until his flashlight beam fell upon a section of wall that looked out of place. The bricks were newer, the cement uneven. He knelt, brushed the dust away, and found the faint edge of metal beneath the surface. With his pocket knife, he scraped it clean, revealing what looked like a sealed iron door, its frame swallowed by crude concrete. Carved near the center, almost invisible under rust, were 2 letters, AM. The cuts were deliberate, straight, carved with care. He touched the initials lightly. The metal was cold, unnaturally cold, like something buried in winter ground. For a moment he felt an odd pulse through his fingertips, as though the metal itself remembered the hand that carved it. He stepped back, steadying his breath, and tried prying at the edge with his crowbar, but the wall refused to give. After a while he sank onto the floor, sweat clinging to his skin despite the chill. The flashlight flickered, and for an instant he thought he saw a shadow pass across the letters, quick and fluid, like a small hand brushing dust away. He blinked, and it was gone. He went upstairs, shaken, clutching the recorder like a lifeline. When he played the new tape, static filled the room, followed by the faint hum of wind through cracks, and then something else. A whisper, small and clear. It said his name. Eli. The voice was unmistakably that of a child, soft and near, like someone standing just behind him. He turned the hair rising on his arms, but there was only the stillness of the room and the fading glow of the lantern. He turned the recorder off and sat motionless, every sense sharpened. Outside, rain began again, tapping gently on the roof, washing over the bricks that had witnessed too many nights like this. Somewhere beneath them, behind the wall, marked AM, the silence waited, patient and listening. Eli Carter could not shake the image of the sealed door and the small, carved letters AM. They filled his thoughts while he ate, while he tried to sleep, even when he listened to the morning news humming from the old radio in the bakery across the street. Nora asked him once if he was still hearing the noises. He lied and said no. The truth was, the sounds had stopped, but the silence had grown heavier, as if whatever was behind that wall was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. One cold morning, he decided to bring in help. The local paper listed a retired construction worker named George Atkins, who did odd jobs for cheap. George was old enough to have lived through the fire himself, his skin weathered and his eyes sharp with suspicion. When Eli explained he needed a small section of wall drilled open in the bank's basement, George frowned, but agreed. "That building's cursed," he muttered as they descended the creaking stairs. "You smell that?" "That's not just mold. It's trapped air, maybe gas from the fire. Don't breathe too deep." Eli watched as George positioned the drill and began cutting through the concrete that sealed the metal door. The machine's echo filled the narrow space, bouncing off stone and steel until it sounded like a dozen drills at once. After a few minutes, a sudden hiss of air burst through the opening, sharp and dry, like a gasp. Both men stumbled back. "Ventilation pocket," George coughed. "Been trapped in there for years." They waited, covering their mouths until the air cleared. When the dust settled, Eli saw something glint inside the gap, a corner of rusted metal scorched black at the edges. It wasn't part of the wall. It was a small safe, half melted, the police tape around it, brittle with age. The words "evidence hold" were faintly visible beneath the ash. George stepped closer, squinting. "Looks like they left something behind." He tapped the side of the safe and a hollow sound rang out. "You sure you want to open that?" Eli nodded. "Yes." With effort, they pried it loose. It hit the ground with a heavy thud, sending up another puff of dust that smelled faintly of burnt paper. Eli knelt beside it, tracing the outline of a number etched into the corner, March 17th, 1998, the day after the fire. His hands shook as he peeled away the last strip of yellowed tape and tugged at the latch. It creaked but gave way. Inside lay only one item, a thick envelope, the paper browned at the edges but still sealed. On the front, written in careful cursive, were the words, "For Anna Miller." The date below read March 16th, 1998, one day before the fire. Eli stared at the envelope for a long time before touching it. George, uneasy, rubbed his hands together. "You open it? I'm gone. I don't deal with ghost mail." Eli managed a small nod. "Fair enough." George left muttering about bad luck, and his footsteps faded up the stairs. Alone. Eli set the envelope on his lap. The seal broke easily, the paper fragile with age. Inside were several pages of lined stationery, each filled with the same careful handwriting. The first line read, "My dearest Anna, if you are reading this, it means something has gone wrong." Eli read on his throat, tightening. "You may hear things about me about the bank. Some will say I was dishonest, that I betrayed your mother. Do not believe them. The truth is harder and more dangerous. If anything happens, go to the basement. There is a key waiting for you hidden where you used to play. It will open the small vault behind the old teller's counter. Inside, you'll find the documents they fear most." The letter was signed, "With all my love, Henry Whitlock." Eli sat still, absorbing the name. He remembered it from the newspaper archives Nora kept in a drawer behind the counter. Henry Whitlock, the bank's vice president, who died in the fire trying to save records from the vault. He had been hailed as a hero, but rumors had followed embezzlement, fraud, mismanagement. No one ever proved anything. The handwriting was neat, formal, but the closing lines trembled slightly, as though written in a hurry. "Forgive me, Anna. I should have been braver. I should have told you the truth about who I am. But in this town, some truths are punished. I will make it right." Eli read that line 3 times before it sank in. The truth about who I am. It wasn't phrased like a metaphor. He felt the weight of implication settle slowly, unbearably. Henry Whitlock hadn't just been a mentor to Margaret Miller, as the old news stories had claimed. He was Anna's father, a secret hidden beneath a scandal that could have ruined them both. Eli folded the letter gently, staring at the burned edges. He thought of the initials carved into the sealed door, AM, and the laughter on his recordings. A girl running towards a basement just as her father had told her to, while the building burned above her. He imagined the smoke filling the corridors, the sound of timbers collapsing, the child's small hand clutching a key. He stood and walked through the empty halls, the letter clutched in his palm, every step echoing with the memory of what might have happened here. In his mind, he could almost see it. Margaret shouting for Anna, the fire roaring through the walls, Henry trying to reach them. He wondered if the letter had ever been meant to save her, or simply to confess before the end. That night, unable to rest, Eli spread the letter on the table under the light of his lantern and began copying every word into his notebook. The ink smudged where his hand trembled. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint smell of rain and burnt cedar. When the clock struck midnight, he heard a faint metallic click from somewhere below, like a lock turning. He froze, listening. The sound came again, softer this time, then silence. He leaned closer to the floorboards, his pulse racing. From the darkness beneath, something shifted, a whisper of movement, a draft of cold air rising through the cracks, and a faint hollow sound, as if a child were knocking on metal from far away. The discovery of Henry Whitlock's letter haunted Eli through every waking hour. He carried it folded in his pocket as if afraid the words might disappear if he left them behind. The name Grace Whitlock lingered at the back of his mind from the newspaper clippings, Henry's wife, who had left town after the fire and never returned. Nora mentioned once while handing him coffee that Grace was still alive in a care home near the state line. It took Eli 2 days to gather the courage to go. The drive wound through pine forests still scarred from the fire seasons of recent years. He thought of how quickly things burned, how little it took for something to vanish forever. The Maplewood Care Center stood on a hill overlooking the river, its paint peeling, but the garden well kept. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and antiseptic. A nurse guided him down a corridor lined with framed photographs of Ashford pines, back when the town still had life. Grace sat near a window wrapped in a blue blanket, staring at a tree heavy with late autumn leaves. Her hair was white and thin, her hands frail but steady when she reached for her tea. Eli introduced himself gently, explaining who he was, what he had found, and why he'd come. When he said Anna's name, Grace's eyes sharpened, cutting through the fog of age. "Anna Miller," she repeated almost to herself. "People said she died, but that's not true." She gripped the armrest and pushed herself upright, trembling but fierce. "I saw her. That night. She lived." Eli leaned forward, his breath caught. "You saw her alive?" Grace nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. "The fire was everywhere, smoke so thick I couldn't breathe. Henry had gone back inside to find them Margaret and the little girl. I was outside the back alley when I saw a firefighter carry someone out, a man taller than the rest, wearing no helmet, just a scarf over his mouth. In his arms was Anna, wrapped in his coat. He didn't stop, didn't wait for help. He ran toward the forest behind the bank and vanished." Eli's heart pounded. "Do you know who he was?" Grace shook her head. "They said everyone on duty that night was accounted for, but I know what I saw. Henry died trying to save them, but someone else saved her." She closed her eyes for a long moment, then whispered, "He looked right at me before he disappeared. I think he knew me." Eli wrote down every word. When she opened her eyes again, her voice had softened. "If Henry wrote that letter, it means he knew he couldn't save them himself. Maybe he trusted someone else to do it." She reached for Eli's hand, her fingers cool and trembling. "Find her," she said. "Find the man who carried her. She deserves to be known." That night, Eli drove back to Ashford Pines under a heavy sky. The wind carried the smell of wet leaves, and in the reflection of the windshield he could see the faint outline of the burned bank tower against the moonlight. He thought of Grace's words, the image of a man running through fire with a child in his arms vanishing into the trees. It was too vivid to be memory's trick. The next morning he went to the county records office and requested access to the fire department archives from 1998. The clerk, a young woman with cautious eyes, hesitated, but eventually led him to a basement room filled with old binders and smoke-scented folders. Hours passed before he found the list of emergency responders. Among the familiar names, one stood out: Owen Brooks. His report was incomplete pages, missing a signature, smudged at the bottom. There was a note in the margin written by a supervisor, Brooks reassigned after incident. Retired 1999. A small address label at the bottom read, Coos Bay, Oregon. Eli drove north the next morning, the highway cutting through rain and fog. The journey took him 2 days, and by the time he reached Coos Bay, the light had faded into a misty dusk. Owen Brooks lived in a modest house near the shore, surrounded by stacks of driftwood and rusting tools. The man who opened the door was in his 70s. Tall, lean, with eyes that had seen more than they cared to remember. "You came a long way," Owen said, his voice gravelly but calm. "I figured one day someone might." Eli explained about the bank, the sealed vault, the letter, and Grace's memory of that night. Owen listened in silence, hands resting on the back of a wooden chair. When Eli finished, the older man turned toward the window, where the ocean stretched gray and endless. "She lived," he said quietly. "The girl. I carried her out myself." Eli exhaled, half in relief, half in disbelief. "Where did you take her?" Owen's jaw tightened. "I don't know who else was supposed to help. The bank wasn't just burning, it was collapsing. I found her under a stairwell, coughing, holding something looked like a small key. I thought she was gone until she moved. I took her out through the rear alley, but by the time I reached the main road, nobody was there. The fire engines were blocked by debris. I couldn't go back." He rubbed his hands together as if trying to remove old ash. "I brought her to the medical post, but the chaos..." His voice broke off. "Someone came for her before dawn. A man in a dark coat said he was family. He showed credentials I didn't have time to read. They drove off. When I reported it, they told me no such pickup had been logged. After that, I was reassigned, then retired. I didn't talk about it again." Eli felt a chill crawl down his spine. "You're saying someone took her?" Owen nodded. "Yes. And they made sure no one could find her again." He turned to face Eli fully now, his eyes steady. "She didn't die in that fire. But whatever they did after whoever they made her into..." He shook his head slowly. "She's not Anna Miller anymore." The The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Eli tried to speak, but couldn't. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, the surf crashed against the rocks with a sound that felt almost human, like a cry swallowed by time. Owen sat down, staring into the dark. Some things he said finally burn without flames, and some never stop burning at all. Eli sat across from Owen Brooks in the dim light of the small coastal house, the sound of waves outside filling the silence that followed the older man's confession. Owen looked exhausted, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted a cup of cold coffee. "I didn't know who to trust," he said finally, his voice rough with guilt. "After the fire, they blamed Henry Whitlock for everything: embezzlement, fraud, even arson. Said he burned the place to destroy evidence. He was dead, couldn't defend himself, so they closed the case quick. The whole town wanted someone to blame." Eli leaned forward. "But you knew he didn't start it." Owen nodded. "I saw what he did. He went back into that fire to save them. People don't risk their lives for crimes they planned." His eyes drifted toward the window to the gray expanse of the Pacific. "I wanted to tell the truth, but the department warned me off. They said if I valued my job, I'd let it rest. They didn't want the fire connected to whatever Whitlock had uncovered in that vault." He paused, then continued quietly. "So I took the girl north. She was barely breathing when I found her. She kept holding a little necklace, silver, shaped like a heart. Had the letters AM carved on the back. She wouldn't let it go even when she slept." Eli could see her in his mind, a soot-streaked child, clutching the last piece of her past. "Where did you take her?" he asked. "To a convent," Owen replied. "A quiet place in Montana. The Sisters of Mercy took her in. I thought she'd be safe there. I left her with a note and enough money to care for her. I told them her name was Lily Hart. The rest? I left to God." Eli felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. Anna Miller had lived, but she had lived as someone else. "Did you ever see her again?" he asked. Owen shook his head. "No, I wrote once years later. The letter came back unopened. After that, I stopped looking. Maybe she deserved peace, a life without the shadow of what happened." He stood slowly, joints creaking, and reached for a small wooden box on the shelf. Inside were a few folded papers, a photograph of a younger Owen in uniform, and a scrap of newsprint. He handed it to Eli. It was a clipping from the Ashford Gazette, dated 6 years earlier. The headline read, "Local social worker helps restore historic bank building permit." Beneath it was a photograph of a woman standing in front of the old Ashford Savings Bank, smiling faintly beside a town official. Her name printed below, Lily Hart. Eli stared at the image until his throat went dry. She was older now, maybe 30, her hair chestnut brown, her expression calm and kind. But the shape of her eyes, the tilt of her chin, it was her. "That's her," Owen said quietly. "I didn't know she was still in Ashford Pines. Looks like the circle's closing, doesn't it?" Eli felt the world shift beneath him. The woman who had signed his property transfer, who'd handed him the papers to buy the bank, she was the child he'd been searching for. The missing girl who had haunted the town's silence. He left Oregon before dawn, driving through fog and memory. When he reached Ashford Pines, the first snow had begun to fall, dusting the blackened rooftops in white. The bank loomed over the main street as it always had, wounded but standing. He parked across from the county office, heart hammering. Inside, he asked the receptionist for Lily Hart. "She's out back," the woman said pleasantly, "checking donation forms." Eli waited near the door until he saw her, a woman in a navy coat. Papers in hand, her steps measured, graceful. When she looked up, her gaze, was warm, polite. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, recognizing him. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Is there a problem with the deed?" He couldn't speak at first. The words caught somewhere between awe and dread. He finally managed, "I need to show you something." In the quiet of the office, he placed the faded photograph on the desk. The woman and child, outside the bank, the same smile captured decades earlier. Lily leaned closer, curiosity softening her face. "That's beautiful," she murmured. "Is that from the old bank archives?" Her hand hesitated over the photo. Eli watched the moment confusion entered her eyes, followed by something deeper, flicker of fear. "I've seen this building before," she said slowly. "When I was little, maybe in a dream, but I don't remember these people." Eli swallowed hard. "The little girl," he said gently. "That's you?" She looked at him, startled, a faint tremor in her breath. "That can't be right. I was adopted when I was 6. The sister said my parents died in an accident. I don't know anything before that." He told her what Owen had confessed, the fire, the rescue, the name change, the lie meant to protect her. She listened in silence, her eyes glassy with shock. When he finished, she whispered, "I don't remember any of it. Sometimes when I pass the old bank, I feel something. Like pressure in my chest, like I can't breathe. When the church bells ring, it gets worse. I thought it was just nerves." She pressed a hand to her heart, breathing unevenly. Eli wanted to say something to comfort her, but his voice failed. The only sound between them was the ticking of the office clock. Then, as she adjusted her collar, something small glinted against her skin, a silver pendant shaped like a heart. Eli's eyes widened. "May I see that?" he asked. Lily touched the necklace unconsciously. "This." She lifted it into the light. The engraving was worn but visible. "AM." She smiled faintly. "I've had this for as long as I can remember. The sister said it was found with me. I always wondered what it meant." Eli's hand trembled as he reached toward it, but stopped himself. "It was yours," he said softly. "Anna Miller." Her lips parted in disbelief, her voice breaking on a whisper. "That name feels familiar, but I don't know why." For a long moment they sat in silence. Outside, the first bell from the church across the square began to toll. The sound drifted through the open window, low and resonant. Lily flinched, pressing her fingers to her temples. "It's happening again," she murmured. "That sound is the same one. I can't." She stopped breathing, fast. Eyes distant. Eli stepped closer, steadying her shoulder. "It's all right," he said quietly. "You're safe. You've been safe all along." She shook her head, tears welling. "If I was safe, why does it still hurt?" Her words hung heavy in the air, fragile as glass. Eli looked at her at the small, heart-shaped pendant catching the weak light, and understood that survival was never simple. Some memories did not die in flames, they lived on in the quiet, waiting to be remembered. And somewhere deep inside, the woman named Lily Hart, a child named Anna, was beginning to wake. The following morning, Eli met Lily at the edge of the town square, the air brittle with cold, and the faint scent of pine drifting through the wind. She had not slept. He could tell from the shadows beneath her eyes. The small silver pendant hung against her collarbone, glinting every time she moved. "You said there was a vault," she murmured, her voice unsteady. "The one from the letter." Eli nodded. "There's a key hidden somewhere you once knew. Maybe seeing it will bring something back." She hesitated before following him across the street towards the old bank, the building rising like a scar from another lifetime. Inside, the faint smell of soot still lingered. Dust stirred in the weak light from the broken windows, swirling around them like restless ghosts. Lily's footsteps echoed softly as they descended to the basement. When her flashlight beam caught the concrete wall, she froze. "I've been here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I remember hiding under those stairs." She knelt, touching the cold floor. "Someone told me to stay quiet, that help was coming." Eli placed a hand on her shoulder. "You listened? That's how you survived." They found the sealed iron door exactly as he had left it. The initials AM glimmered faintly beneath the dust. When Lily removed the heart-shaped pendant from her neck, the tiny key hidden behind the clasp fit perfectly into a small keyhole he had not noticed before. The lock turned with a slow, metallic sigh, and the door released a draft of cold air that smelled of ash and forgotten paper. Inside was a narrow chamber lined with old safety deposit boxes, most of them scorched beyond recognition. In the center stood one larger vault, blackened but intact. Together they pried it open. Instead of gold or bonds, they found a single VHS tape labeled March 16, 1998, and a folder bound with a leather strap. Lily picked up the tape, her hand trembling. "Who even uses these anymore?" she said with a faint, humorless smile. Eli examined the folder. The documents inside were still legible bank transfers, offshore account ledgers, and signed approvals bearing the initials PR. The sums were enormous, routed through shell companies linked to lumber contracts. He turned a page and froze. Each signature was identical to those in old city archives he had read researching the property deed. "Paul Riker," he muttered. "The mayor." Lily looked up sharply. "The mayor. The one everyone said died in the fire." He nodded slowly. "The same. They found an old VHS player in a storage cabinet upstairs, covered in dust but functional. When the screen flickered to life, the image was shaky, filmed from the corner of an office. Henry Whitlock sat behind a desk, pale and sweating, his sleeves rolled up. Across from him stood Paul Riker, his face tense, his voice rising. The static muffled parts of their argument, but the fear in Henry's tone was unmistakable. "You can't keep doing this," he said. "It's blood money. You're burning through the forest for profit, and now you're laundering it through the bank." "It's wrong, Paul." The mayor leaned closer, his expression cold. "Do you think anyone will believe you? After what I've done for this town for you?" Henry shook his head. "I'm not afraid of losing my job. I'm afraid of losing her." Riker frowned. Henry's voice cracked. "My daughter, Anna, she's innocent in all this. Don't drag her into your greed." The sound distorted as Riker slammed his hand against the desk. "If you talk, the bank goes down and so do you. You'll destroy her future before she even grows up." Henry stood defiant. "Better the truth destroys us than your lies keep us alive." The screen shook as the camera tilted, capturing Riker's face in a harsh light. "You'll regret that," he hissed. The final image froze on Henry's pleading expression as he shouted, "Don't burn it, Paul. Don't hurt the girl." The tape ended in static. Lily covered her mouth, tears gathering in her eyes. "He tried to stop it," she whispered. Eli ejected the tape, his hands unsteady. He died for it. He opened the folder again, scanning the documents with growing clarity. Riker was using the bank to launder money from illegal logging. When Henry tried to expose it, Riker set the fire to erase the evidence. He didn't just destroy the building, he destroyed every life tied to it. Lily's voice quivered. "But Riker died in the fire too, didn't he?" Eli shook his head. "Maybe not." He remembered the antique shop near the edge of town, Ralston's Curiosities, where he had bought replacement hinges for the vault door weeks ago. The owner, Peter Ralston, had always worn long sleeves and gloves even in warm weather. His left cheek had a faint sheen of scar tissue, which Eli had assumed was from an old accident. The man rarely smiled, but his voice carried authority and old confidence that never quite matched the humility of a shopkeeper. Eli felt the realization sink like ice through his veins. If Riker survived, he said slowly, he would have needed a new identity, new records. Someone who could start over without question. He flipped the folder to the last page, where a police note was stapled. Subject PR, presumed deceased, partial remains recovered. The handwriting beneath, in blue ink, added body unconfirmed. Lily's eyes widened. "Peter Ralston," she whispered, understanding dawning. "The man from the antique store." Eli nodded grimly. "He's been here all along." He closed the folder, the paper crackling like dried leaves. He built a new life out of the ashes of the old one. And now we know why he never leaves town. Lily shivered, her hand tightening around the pendant. "If he started the fire," she said softly. "He tried to kill me." Eli looked toward the dark stairwell leading back to the street. "He thinks he succeeded." They packed the tape and documents, carefully locking them in Eli's satchel. As they left the basement, the sound of wind whistled through the cracks in the walls like distant whispers. The main hall stood silent, the afternoon light cutting through the broken windows, illuminating the dust like smoke frozen in time. Lily paused at the door, glancing back once more at the vault. "It feels different now," she said. "Like the building finally remembers what happened." Eli nodded. "So do we." He locked the door behind them, the echo of metal on metal ringing through the empty space. Somewhere down the street, the bells of St. Mary's began to toll, slow and steady, each chime pulling something heavy from memory's depths. Lily turned toward the sound, her face pale but resolute. "We have to tell someone," she said. Eli looked toward the corner where Ralston's antique shop stood in the fading light, its windows reflecting the last gold of sunset. "We will," he murmured. But first we find out how much he still remembers. The next morning, the sun rose pale over Ashford Pines, thin and uncertain, as if hesitant to touch the town's forgotten corners. Eli and Lily sat in the small conference room of the sheriff's station. The VHS tape and the folder of documents laid neatly on the table. Across from them, Sheriff Collins adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable, as he flipped through the first few pages. "You're telling me this tape was found in the old bank?" he asked. Eli nodded. "In the basement vault. It shows Henry Whitlock confronting Paul Riker, the mayor, about illegal logging and money laundering. The fire wasn't an accident." Collins sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Mr. Carter, Miss Hart. I'm not saying I don't believe you, but this case was closed nearly 30 years ago. The official record says Riker died in that fire." Lily's voice was quiet, but firm. "Then how do you explain Peter Ralston?" The sheriff hesitated. "Mr. Ralston is a respected man in this town. He's donated to every local program we've had. He helped rebuild the library, the school gym. You're accusing a benefactor of murder based on a tape and some old paperwork." Eli leaned forward. "We're not accusing. We're showing you evidence. Look at the signatures, the accounts, the footage. This man burned a building to hide his crimes, and he's still here walking free." Collins closed the folder and shook his head. "Even if what you're saying were true, the statute of limitations has passed for most of it. We can't reopen a case without federal authorization, I'm sorry." His tone softened. "Sometimes it's better to leave ghosts where they rest." Lily stared at him, disbelief clouding her face. "You mean let him get away with it?" Collins stood. "I mean let the dead stay buried." Outside, the winter air was sharp, and the light fading fast. They walked in silence past the shops along Main Street, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the pavement. "He doesn't believe us," Lily said at last. Eli shook his head. "He believes us. He's afraid to act." They reached the corner where Ralston's antique store stood, its windows glowing warmly from within. Through the glass, Ralston himself moved slowly behind the counter, arranging a display of silver clocks. When his eyes lifted and met Eli's across the street, a faint smile crossed his face, a calm, knowing smile. Lily turned away, shivering. "He knows," she whispered. "He knows we found the tape." That night, Eli stored the tape and documents back in the bank's vault, locking them inside a metal drawer he'd reinforced earlier. He didn't trust the sheriff, and he didn't trust the quiet way the town seemed to close around them like a hand tightening. The wind picked up as dusk settled, and by midnight the first flames appeared. A passerby spotted smoke curling from the bank's windows and called for help. Eli woke to the smell of burning wood and the sharp crack of glass breaking. He rushed downstairs to see fire crawling across the old floorboards, licking at the walls as if the building itself had remembered how to die. "Lily!" he shouted, coughing through the smoke. She appeared from the hallway, her coat half-singed, eyes wide with panic. "Someone broke in," she cried. "The vault, it's open together." They fought through the heat and debris, trying to reach the back corridor. The air was thick and unbreathable, every breath a struggle. Eli wrapped his jacket around her shoulders, pushing her toward the door. "Go," he ordered. She hesitated, refusing to leave him, but he forced her forward. The ceiling groaned and collapsed behind them, sending sparks through the air like angry fireflies. Outside, the firefighters were already arriving, but the flames had grown too fast, too deliberate. This wasn't an accident. Someone had soaked the basement with accelerant. As Eli turned back to look, a beam gave way above him, striking his shoulder and throwing him to the ground. Pain shot through his chest as the smoke closed around him. He saw Lily's silhouette through the haze, reaching for him, her voice faint against the roar. Eli. He tried to rise, but couldn't. His vision dimmed, the heat folding around him like a blanket. Then slowly, the sound of the fire faded. He was standing in the basement again, but it wasn't the same. The air was cooler, clearer. The walls were whole, untouched by flame. In the corner, a small figure crouched, a little girl with ash in her hair, clutching a silver necklace. She looked up at him, and for a moment he thought she was Lily, but her eyes were wide with terror, her cheeks streaked with soot. "Help," she whispered. "Please help." Behind her, the faint echo of voices rose, a woman calling her name, the crackle of flames spreading. Eli turned towards the stairwell, where light flickered against the walls. Through the smoke, a figure appeared, a man in fire gear mask pulled low, moving quickly through the haze. The child ran toward him, arms outstretched. He knelt, gathering her into his arms, whispering words Eli couldn't hear. As the man turned, the firelight caught his face, and Eli froze. He knew that face even though he hadn't seen it in years. It was older, lined with smoke and grief, but unmistakable. It was his father. Eli's breath caught. His father had died when he was 20, a firefighter who never spoke of his past. He had always told Eli that some fires left marks no water could erase. Now he understood. The images shifted, the man carrying the girl through the flames, glancing back once before the ceiling fell. Eli felt his throat tighten, tears blurring his vision. The man looked straight at him as if seeing through time itself, then disappeared into the smoke with the child in his arms. When Eli opened his eyes, the night was cold again, and he was lying on the ground outside the burning bank. Paramedics crowded around him, voices muffled by sirens. Lily knelt beside him, her hands covered in ash, her face streaked with soot and tears. "You're all right," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're safe now." He tried to speak but only coughed. Through the haze he could see the fire, reflected in her eyes, the same fire that had once taken everything from her. The same fire that had somehow bound their fates together. As they loaded him into the ambulance, his gaze drifted toward the collapsing roof of the bank. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow at the far edge of the crowd. A tall man in a dark coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat, watching silently as the flames consumed what was left of the past. Then the doors closed, and the siren wailed, carrying them away into the night, where smoke still clung to the sky like memory refusing to fade. Eli woke in the hospital to the sound of rain against the window and the soft hum of medical machines. His shoulder was bandaged, his ribs bruised, but he was alive. Lily sat beside him, her eyes red from exhaustion. The fire had been contained before it reached the vault room, though most of the upper floor was gone. They said it started near the back window, she told him quietly. Accelerant was found again. Whoever did this wanted everything gone. He nodded weakly, his voice hoarse. Ralston. The name carried weight, heavy as ash. The sheriff had visited earlier but offered nothing except formal condolences and talk of insurance. No investigation, no arrests. Just another tragedy written off as bad luck. When Lily left to get coffee, Eli turned to the small bag the nurse had placed on the bedside table. Inside were his personal effects, wallet, keys, and a small, smoke-stained notebook he didn't recognize. The cover was worn, the edges blackened. He flipped it open and froze when he saw the handwriting. It was his father's. The entries were dated 27 years earlier. March 17th, 1998. Fire at Ashford Savings. Found a child alive under the south stairwell. Henry Whitlock. Dead in main vault. Riker responsible. Ordered silence from higher up. Threatened with dismissal. Eli turned to the page, his pulse quickening. I saved the girl, but they made me erase my report. Said if I spoke, they'd take my badge, my pension, my name. Couldn't risk losing Eli, too. Sometimes I wonder if silence is just another kind of fire. Slow, steady, burning what's left of conscience. The words blurred as Eli's eyes filled. His father had been the firefighter in Anna's memory. He had carried her out only to live burdened by a truth he could never tell. I tried to protect him from the past, the final entry read. But maybe one day he'll find it himself. When Lily returned, Eli handed her the notebook with trembling hands. She read the entries in silence, tears falling onto the paper. He saved me, she whispered. Your father saved me. Eli nodded slowly, and he paid for it every day after. The truth settled between them like smoke that refused to clear. He realized then that the fire had never really ended. It had simply changed form, passing from one generation to the next. He had been living inside it all along. 2 days later, Eli checked himself out of the hospital against the doctor's advice. He drove home through the rain, every street in Ashford Pines looking smaller than he remembered. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with his father's notebook, the VHS tape, and the folder of evidence spread before him. He thought about silence, how it had protected men like Riker and destroyed those who tried to speak. His father's words echoed in his head, "Silence is just another kind of fire." He turned on his old laptop, connected the VHS to a converter, and began uploading the footage. The process took hours, but when it was done, he added a scanned copy of the notebook and the banking records. He wrote only one line beneath the files: "The truth was buried in Ashford Pines. It deserves light." Then he pressed upload. By morning, the video had spread across the state. Local journalists arrived by noon, followed by national outlets. Old residents began speaking out, former bank clerks, fire survivors, even Grace Whitlock through a recorded statement from the care home. The town divided overnight. Some praised Eli as a hero for uncovering corruption. Others called him reckless for tarnishing Ashford Pines' fragile peace. Ralston's antique shop closed by midday, a for sale sign taped hastily to the door. Rumors swirled that he had fled, but 2 nights later, police cars surrounded his house at the edge of town. When they brought him out in handcuffs, the cameras flashed like lightning. His face was calm, expressionless beneath the brim of his hat. Eli watched the footage on television from his darkened living room, the faint light from the screen flickering across his bandaged hand. The reporter's voice narrated that the FBI had reopened the case under charges of arson, fraud, and obstruction. Then the broadcast cut to a brief interview outside the station. A journalist called out, "Mr. Ralston, do you have anything to say about the fire?" Ralston turned his scarred face toward the camera, his eyes, tired voice almost tender. "I never meant for anyone to die," he said. "I only wanted to scare Henry to make him stop digging. The fire spread faster than we planned. I tried to stop it. I swear I did." He paused, swallowing hard. But once it starts, fire doesn't listen. Then he looked down, and for the first time, Eli saw not defiance, but the hollow resignation of a man consumed by his own creation. The screen faded to black. Eli sat in silence for a long time. Rain tapped gently against the windows, a slow rhythm that felt almost forgiving. He opened his father's notebook again, tracing the last line with his finger. Maybe one day he'll find it himself. A faint smile touched his lips, both grief and gratitude entwined. He had found it, the truth. But it had cost him everything: the home, the quiet, the safety of ignorance. He glanced toward the corner of the room where Lily slept on the couch, her pendant catching the soft light. She had her answers now, but answers rarely healed what they revealed. He turned off the television and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet pine and ashes. Across the street, the charred remains of the bank stood silhouetted against the faint glow of dawn. Steam rose from the wreckage like ghosts exhaling. He walked closer, feeling the mud cling to his boots, the wind cold against his face. Somewhere beneath those ruins lay the last traces of his father's secret, of Riker's greed, of the child who had once hidden in fear. And though the fire was gone, its memory lingered in the cracks in the soil, in the people who still whispered its name when night grew long. Eli closed his eyes and listened. For a moment he thought he could hear the faint sound of a girl's laughter, distant but real, carried by the morning wind like forgiveness finally finding its way home. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if the earth itself hesitated to begin again after all it had seen. The snow around Ashford Pines melted into dark ribbons along the roadside, revealing the shape of a town learning how to live with its ghosts. The fire was gone, but its shadow lingered on the charred remains of the bank, in the cautious glances of townsfolk who had once chosen silence over truth. In the small cemetery on the hill above the river, a new headstone stood among the older ones, the engraving simple and clear: Henry Whitlock, 1949, 1998. Devoted father. Courage beyond measure. Lily stood before it with a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the edge of town, her hair moving gently in the breeze. The reburial had taken place quietly, attended only by a few who understood what his name truly meant. Grace Whitlock's letter from the nursing home had confirmed his final wish to be laid to rest, not as a criminal, but as a man who tried to protect the truth. Eli stood a few feet behind her, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line where the smoke from the town's chimneys curled upward. He had never been comfortable in cemeteries. They always made him feel as if the earth were whispering things he wasn't ready to hear. But today felt different. The air was cool and clean, and the light filtered through the branches in soft gold. Lily knelt, setting the flowers at the base of the headstone. Her voice was calm, almost steady. "You did what you thought was right," she said quietly. "You tried to protect me the only way you knew how. I spent years wondering who I was, where I came from, but I think now I understand." She paused, her fingers brushing the name carved in stone. "I forgive you, Father. I forgive everyone who tried to hide me, because if they hadn't, I wouldn't be here today." When she stood, Eli saw tears glinting on her cheeks, though she smiled through them. "It's strange," she said softly, "to mourn someone I remember and don't remember at the same time." He nodded. "Memory is like smoke," he said. "It clings even when the fire's gone." The two stood in silence for a long time, the wind moving gently through the grass. A small group of workers continued at the far edge of the cemetery, finishing the reinterment of Henry's remains. One of them, a young man in a gray uniform, approached hesitantly. "Mr. Carter," he said, holding a small envelope wrapped in plastic. "We found this inside the coat pocket during the transfer. It's old, but still legible." He handed it to Eli and stepped back. Eli stared at the envelope, his chest tightening. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting faint but unmistakable. "To my daughter, if she survives." He looked at Lily, who watched silently as he carefully unfolded the letter. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were still clear. "My dearest Anna, if by some miracle you live, find Eli Carter. He is the kind of man I wish I had been honest, brave, and kind. He will keep you safe when I no longer can." The signature beneath it, Henry Whitlock, was smudged as though written in haste. Eli's throat tightened, his vision blurring. He could barely form words. He knew, he whispered. He knew my father would find her. Lily's eyes widened, realization dawning. "Your father saved me because Henry asked him to," she said softly. They trusted each other even when everything around them was falling apart. Eli pressed the letter to his chest, overwhelmed by the weight of generations colliding in one fragile truth. "All these years," he said quietly, "I thought my father carried guilt for something he couldn't change. But he wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting me from the same fire that burned them all." The air seemed to thicken with memory, the world holding its breath. He looked at Lily, her pendant glinting in the sunlight, the same heart-shaped charm that had once hung from a frightened child's neck. She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. "Your father saved my life," she said, "and your father gave me back my name. Maybe that's how the world makes amends through the people left behind." They stood together as the last of the workers departed the hill, growing quiet again. Below them, the town stretched in shades of gold and gray, half alive, half remembering. For the first time, Eli felt something shift inside him. Not relief, not triumph, but a deep and fragile peace. He looked toward the horizon, where the ruins of the bank still stood behind a temporary fence. The structure was blackened and hollow, yet somehow still dignified, as if refusing to vanish entirely. "Maybe it's time to rebuild," Lily said softly, following his gaze. "Not the bank," he replied. "Something better." The breeze carried the faint sound of church bells from the town square, each note slow and deliberate, echoing through the valley. Lily tilted her head toward the sound, her eyes closing briefly. "It doesn't hurt as much anymore," she murmured. "Maybe it's because now I know why it rings." Eli smiled faintly, his voice low. "Because the past is answering back." He unfolded the letter one last time, smoothing its creases before tucking it into his jacket. Somewhere deep within him, a knot loosened the burden of silence that had passed from father to son, now finally released. The sins of one man had burned down a town. but the courage of another had carried a child through the fire. In the end, those two stories met here, beneath the soft earth and the trembling spring light. Two families bound not by blood or vengeance, but by survival. Lily knelt again, tracing her father's name with her fingertips, then whispered, "Rest now, Father. We're all right." The wind rose gently, carrying her words into the open sky. Eli felt the sting of tears he didn't try to hide. For a long moment, they simply stood there, two lives intertwined by the ashes of old choices. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the graves, it seemed to Eli that the circle had finally closed. The fire that had divided their families had in the end bound them together. He turned toward the path leading back to town, his steps slow, deliberate. Behind him, Lily lingered by the grave, the pendant at her neck catching the last light of day. The air smelled faintly of rain and pine, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled softly, like the earth exhaling after years of holding its breath. A full year had passed since the night the truth rose from the ashes of Ashford Pines. Seasons had come and gone, each one softening the edges of the town's sorrow. Where the blackened shell of the old bank once stood, a new building gleamed beneath the morning sun. The townspeople gathered along Main Street, their faces bright with cautious hope. Above the new glass doors hung a bronze plaque engraved with simple words, "The Henry and Eli Carter Memorial Home." It wasn't a bank anymore, but a refuge, a place for families who had lost everything to fire, for people starting over when the world had taken too much. Lily stood on the small stage outside a microphone, trembling slightly in her hands as she looked at the crowd. Her voice carried across the street, gentle yet steady. "This building once held fear, loss, and silence," she began. "But today it stands for something else: memory, forgiveness, and rebuilding. My father, Henry Whitlock, gave his life to protect the truth. And Eli Carter's father gave his to protect me. Their courage brought us here." She paused, her eyes glancing upward to the building's restored facade. Sunlight filtered through a new skylight installed where the roof had once collapsed in flames. "A year ago," she continued, "I couldn't stand the sound of church bells. Today I hear them as a reminder that even after the fire, the world keeps ringing." The audience was silent, except for the soft rustle of wind. Nora Mayfield stood near the front, tears shining in her eyes. Beside her were the firefighters who had helped save the building a second time, the volunteers who had painted the walls, the children holding flowers gathered from the hillside. When Lily finished, the crowd applauded, the sound rolling like distant thunder across the valley. Inside, the memorial smelled of fresh paint and cedar. The old vault had been cleaned and transformed into a small exhibit, its walls lined with photographs of those who had once worked there, Henry, Margaret, and others whose lives had been touched by the fire. In the center stood the VHS tape encased in glass, labeled "Evidence of Courage." On the far wall hung the last page of Eli's father's notebook, enlarged, and framed its words faint but clear. "Some fires destroy, others reveal." Eli stood quietly near the back, watching people walk through the rooms, their voices low with reverence. He had refused any speech of his own, saying only that the day belonged to Lily and the town. But as he looked around, he felt something stir, a peace he had never known, a sense that all the weight he had carried might finally be setting down. Later, when the crowd began to thin and the afternoon light softened into gold, Lily found him near the stairwell that led to the basement. "They're ready to close up," she said gently. "Would you like to see it one last time?" He nodded, and together they descended the narrow steps. The basement was unrecognizable now, no longer dark or cold, but filled with light streaming through the new glass panels above. The iron door that had once been sealed shut was gone, replaced by a small memorial alcove. Lily stopped beneath the beam where the fire had left its deepest scar. "Right there," she said softly, "is where you found the vault." She tilted her head back, her eyes catching the faint shimmer from the glass ceiling. It used to be black with soot. Now look at it. Above them, sunlight filtered through, scattering rainbows across the pale stone. "It's strange," she whispered. "Something that once burned so dark now holds the brightest light." Eli watched her for a moment, her face illuminated by the shifting colors, and thought of how far they had both come from ashes to this. "You made it possible," he said quietly. She turned, smiling. "No," she replied. "We all did." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint creak of the new timbers settling, a peaceful sound that felt almost like breathing. When evening fell, the last visitors departed, leaving the building quiet again. The street outside glowed with lanterns, their reflections trembling in the shop windows. Eli stayed behind to lock the doors, the air cool and still. As he turned off the final light, he caught sight of his reflection in the glass panel beside the entrance. But it wasn't just his own. Standing behind him, clear and distinct in the mirrored surface, were two figures. One was Henry Whitlock, his expression calm, proud, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of the man beside him. The other was Eli's father, dressed in his old fireman's uniform, his face lined but kind eyes filled with quiet relief. They stood side by side, both smiling, both bathed in the soft glow from the street lamps outside. Eli's breath caught. For a moment he didn't move, afraid the vision would fade if he blinked. But the figures remained steady and peaceful, as if the walls between what was and what is had thinned just enough for gratitude to pass through. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, and whispered, "It's done, Dad. I finished it." The reflection seemed to nod the faintest movement, and then the light shifted. When he looked again, they were gone. Only his own reflection remained old or worn, but no longer burdened by what had been left unsaid. He stepped outside into the cool night air. The town was quiet, the sky above scattered with stars. Behind him, the new building stood gleaming under the lamplight. The bronze plaque caught the glow and shimmered faintly. As the clock tower struck 9, the automatic lights along the roof flickered on, illuminating the sign across the entrance. The letters glowed softly in the darkness. "From ashes we build again." Eli stood for a long moment, hands in his pockets, watching the light spread across the glass. Somewhere far off, a train horn echoed through the valley, long and low like a farewell carried on the wind. He took a deep breath, the scent of pine and rain filling his lungs. For the first time in years, the air didn't smell like smoke. It smelled like beginning. He turned down the quiet street, his steps steady, the world around him no longer haunted but alive. And behind him, the lights of the memorial burned warm against the night, a promise to every soul who had ever lost something in the fire that even from ruin beauty could rise again. If you've stayed with me until this moment, thank you. Stories like this find their meaning in the hearts of those who listen. So, if you felt something while walking through the ashes of Ashford Pines, don't forget to like this story and subscribe for more tales that stay with you long after they end. I'd love to know what you think. Which moment struck you the most, or which twist caught you by surprise? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and how this story found you tonight.